Hey guys, Jay here and welcome to another cosplay tutorial. So last month I made the Hylian shield and Master Sword from my favorite Zelda game, A Link Between Worlds. And this month I'm going to be continuing with some Zelda builds, and from this video I'm going to be making another prop from A Link Between Worlds, and that's the default shield. So I don't actually remember the name of this, but it's the only other shield in the game. You only get the Hylian shield and this one. So yeah, I'm just going to call it the default shield because it's the first one you get. If you'd like to make this shield for yourself, there'll be a template that you can get to down in the description. Anyway, let's get started. To start, much like all of my other props, I work with a template that I made, which you can get for yourself in the description. And I trace it out onto some 10mm EVA craft foam. I specifically used the wider sheets of foam from the TNT Cosplay because I want to make the whole shape out of a single piece with no center seam. Unlike the Hylian shield, this one doesn't have a curve vertically, only horizontally, so not having a center seam will make it look more accurate. I also make a second layer to thicken up the depth of the shield, but I'll also use this piece to help give it that horizontal curve, which I'll get into a little bit later. I made the second layer with two halves rather than a single piece, but that was only because I ran out of the wider sheets. You won't see the back anyway, so it really doesn't matter. I also cut it out a little bit larger than the template. Once it's glued into the curve, there will be a lot of excess foam that I have to trim off anyway. I glue the center seam together with contact cement. Contact cement isn't like other glue, it needs to be almost dry before you can stick the pieces together. I also use 2 coats every time I use it because the first layer likes to soak into the foam. I guess I forgot to record this, but I carefully stick the 2 pieces together along the center, and I make sure to line it up to the point where it's as flush as possible on the top. Again, you won't see the back, so that's not as big of a deal there, but if it has a large misalignment on the front, it'll be very noticeable on the top layer. Before I glue the layers together, I need to mark where the domed details will go. I'll be using a large DIY ornament that splits in half. I bought a pack of 10, and I'm going to be using 2 of the same half because they'll fit exactly the same, and I don't have to mark which one goes where. I cut out the circles in the template, which denote where these go, lined it up with the top foam layer, and traced the circles onto the foam. Then I used one of the ornament halves because they're slightly larger, I couldn't find the exact size, and centered that onto the circle as best I could, and traced that out. This is the best way I can think of to make sure they go in the right spots. I cut the trim off the template, and you can see here that there's 2 sections of trim, the thicker outer rim, and a smaller strip inside that. As you can see in the video, I'm cutting inside that smaller trim. I traced and cut the entire thing out of 5mm foam, and this is also a wider sheet so that I don't have a center seam in the middle. I also used the dremel to round out the inner edge. You don't have to do this, but I personally liked the look of the rounded edge. Then I test fit the piece to see how it looked. After I was sure that I liked what I had, I cut the trim off the inside of the template so I was just left with the thicker trim. Then I traced that out onto more 10mm foam. Now remember, I said I ran out of the wider 10mm foam? Well, since I didn't have any, I had to use the sheets that were less wide, which meant that I couldn't do the entire trim out of one piece. So this trim does have a center seam, but if you want it to be seamless, just do the exact same thing as the last piece. At the point of making this, literally nobody has any 10mm foam in stock, so I was forced to use what I had. So I folded the template in half and made 2 halves that contact cemented together exactly like the back layer. But before I did, I took the Dremel to it and heavily rounded the top corners to give it a very rounded look. This part should not look like corners. It should look a lot closer like piping going all the way around the edge. And here are all the layers together before gluing. I used the 5mm piece to trace out where it needs to be glued down, so I know where to add the contact cement. I want to try and keep as much of it off the main face as possible, and I use pieces of paper to block off the pieces from sticking together before I want them to. This lets me work on one small section at a time to make sure it doesn't glue down wrong because you can't fix it. I only get one chance. If I mess up now, I have to start over completely from scratch. And then I do the exact same thing for the 10mm piece on top of the 5mm layer. Just like I did with the Hylian shield, when I glue the 2 layers together with contact cement, I pull the sides back on the back layer so they don't touch yet. This lets me stick the top layer down on a much tighter curve to give it the right look. I also kinda didn't stick this down correctly and it kept fighting with me. So the back is actually slightly crooked, but again you won't see the back, so it really makes no difference. The important part is getting that horizontal curve to look right. The only thing that matters is when putting the layers together to make sure the sides aren't touching until you want them to. The rest doesn't matter for this shield. This is kinda hard to film since it's at the edge of the table, but the back layer being folded back to help create the curve creates a bunch of overhang. Just cut it off with a razor knife. I cut mine at an angle so that it was harder to see the thickness, and then used the Dremel to smooth it out a little. I used a small x-acto knife with a new blade to cut open the circles where the ornaments will go. I want them to go into the foam so I can glue them in, which is much more secure than just the edge of them being glued to the surface. I used the Dremel to even out the sides of the shield. This is just making sure the sides are as even as possible between all the layers. I use a heat gun to open the cuts that I made, and while I'm at it, I also go over the entire shield, which is what's called heat sealing. This very slightly melts the foam, shrinking it just a little bit and helping smooth out the surface. It also helps reduce the fuzziness that happens when using the Dremel to sand it down, like on the trim. Just be careful not to burn the foam. And here's what it looks like with the ornaments in place. Don't glue them in yet. Take them out for the next part. The handle is made 100% exactly the same as the Hylian shield. It's 3 pieces of 1/2-inch PVC pipe with 2 90-degree connectors, all friction fit. The grip section was cut to fit my hand, and the 2 pieces that will connect it to the foam are cut to allow my hand to still grab the grip. These measurements will all depend on your hand size, and I didn't measure them at all. I pressed the pipe into the foam and cut out the markings they made so that the pipe can easily fit into the foam. This is actually the same thing I did with the ornament placement on the other side. Then I superglued the handle in place. The strap was also made the exact same way as the one on the Hylian shield. It's a strap of elastic with both ends sandwiched between the back of the shield and a square of 10mm foam. I glued the elastic to the square with super glue first, then once that was dry, I used contact cement to glue the ends to the shield. And I made sure to leave enough slack in the elastic to let my arm through. And I specifically use elastic for shield straps so that it'll be able to fit other people as well. If someone with a larger arm than me were to hold it and the strap wasn't able to stretch, it could break off. With the build done, I need to seal the foam to get it ready for paint. Normally I use Plastidip, but it's been pretty rainy and windy out, so I opt to use matte Mod Podge instead. I can do this indoors with a sponge brush and not worry about the crappy weather outside. I brush on 3 good coats, letting each layer dry completely before adding the next. I can also use a second, cleaner sponge brush to absorb some of the Mod Podge where it pooled in the corners. For paint, I didn't film it, but we had a day with no rain, so I took advantage of it. I started with silver on the trim, and I didn't care if it got onto the face because it'll be covered later. But I did care about the smaller trim, which I'll talk about in a moment. I masked off the silver and the smaller trim and painted the face with a copper spray paint. Then I brought it back in to paint the smaller trim with a gloss black acrylic. This is why I masked that off. Metallic spray paint dries glossy, and painting over it is a nightmare, so masking it off makes it much easier to paint that area. Just be careful not to get black paint on the other parts of the shield. You could mask it off, but I didn't. I just made sure to be extra careful. I also didn't show it, but I painted the inside of the ornaments with a dark red spray paint. This makes it so they still have that glossy plastic finish on the outside. And that's it, I didn't use any clear coat over the shield. It'll knock down all of that metallic paint's finish, as well as the glossy plastic of the ornaments. But it's done. Alright, so that was the build for the default shield from The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. If you liked the video, go ahead and give it that thumbs up, subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys later.